As we unpack John's message, though, we come to this question of the children of Israel, where the religious leaders were putting their hope in them being descendants of Abraham. And John is challenging that he seems to say that God can create a new people from the very dust of the earth, from the stones. And it asks us this question of, are the children of Israel still God's chosen people today? Or, as some people would have us believe, is there a replacement theology that says the church are the new children of Israel? You can make up your own mind. But to help us unpack that, perhaps we can turn to Romans chapter 11. And in Romans chapter 11 we see Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul was born a Jew of the Jews. He was a Jew by birthright, a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin. He was a Pharisee. He was somebody who persecuted the church because he believed he was one of these religious elect. That just as the people who are rejecting John's message saw themselves as the elect of God, Paul saw himself that way. But when he encountered Jesus on the Damascus Road, God met him personally, and consequently he was an apostle with a capital A because he'd met the risen Jesus. And God, in meeting him, totally transformed the whole way he thought and the whole of his theology. And he was a scholar. He knew his scriptures. So if anybody was qualified to answer this question about the children of Israel and whether they're still the chosen people, Paul is that person. And in Romans 11 we get this incredible unpacking of theology, an unpacking of this question. And in chapter 11, verse 1 of Romans, Paul very clearly says God has not rejected his people. The children of Israel still have a special place in the heart of God. But he goes on in verse 7 to say most of the people of Israel have not found the favour of God. And so what we see is that the children of Israel, who were given this important standing before God, were given a responsibility to be the people who were the image of God portrayed to a world. That their responsibility was to come to God and find the favour of God in order that they could represent God to a hurting world. And they hadn't done that, and so consequently, even though they were still a nation who had a special place in the heart of God, many of them failed to find the favour of God. Many of them failed to find being right with God because they rejected Jesus. And consequently, in verse 17, Paul goes on to talk about the Gentiles being ingrafted branches grafted into a tree. And that's a gardening term where you cut a slot in a root and you put a new branch into that rootstock and you bind it up and it becomes part of the tree. That the Gentiles, the church, were ingrafted into the nation of Israel. So rather than replacing the nation of Israel, they become part of the promise of God, part of Abraham's promise. And in verse 17, Paul says that the Gentiles have received the blessing God promised Abraham and his children. So I want us to understand that God hasn't rejected his promise that the nation of Israel are still a nation that has a special place in his heart. And I personally believe that this nation of Israel still has a place in God's heart, but that the church has been grafted in to share in those promises of Israel. Israel are still God's chosen people, but the promise of salvation is the same for them as it is for us. That we all need to repent and accept the Messiah. We all need to repent and receive salvation through Jesus Christ. Otherwise, we all stand under the same judgment. So this promise of God of seeing the nation of Israel as his promised people is a faithful promise that he still has. And I think if you look at world's politics today, you can still see that there's so much of the world that is opposed to the nation of Israel. So much of the world still hates that nation of Israel. And I think in doing that, we see something of the devil being at work in bringing people to oppose the nation of Israel. But does that mean the nation of Israel are good? No. Does it mean that they, the persecuted, become the persecutor? Yes, sometimes it does. Just because they're the chosen people of Israel doesn't mean they've accepted Jesus as their salvation, and doesn't mean that they're portraying the image of God to a hurting world. God's plan for the world came through the person of Jesus Christ. And the church has been grafted in, has been given this opportunity, that the plan of God was that through the church his glory might be revealed to the world. And we're called to fulfill the promises that God called the nation of Israel to fulfill. So our challenge today is, are we going to live out that image that God has called his chosen people to live out?